The back roads of Montana stretch endlessly, where cell towers don't reach and secrets stay buried. Jake Martinez pulled over to fix a flat tire when he spotted something that shouldn't exist, a rusted metal hatch camouflaged beneath decades of overgrown brush. What Jake didn't know was that 23 years ago, he'd been the getaway driver for the most audacious motorcycle theft in American history. A job that went wrong, a job that erased his memory and gave him a new identity. Now, staring into that underground vault filled with pristine Harleys, Indians, and triumphs worth millions, fragments of his forgotten past began clawing back to the surface. The bikes weren't just stolen, they belonged to the Crimson Devils MC, the most ruthless gang on the West Coast, and somewhere in the shadows of his fractured memory, Jake remembered why he'd hidden them here, why he'd betrayed his own brothers, and why they'd been hunting him ever since. The sound of distant engines echoed across the prairie. They'd found him. But how did Jake's own mind lead him back to the very thing that could destroy him? Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the rusted handle of the hatch. The metal groaned in protest, decades of neglect making every movement a struggle. His tire iron served as leverage, and with a final heave, the heavy door swung open on corroded hinges. A musty smell of oil and leather wafted up from the darkness below. He'd been riding these back roads for 15 years, ever since settling in Montana. Every weekend, the same routes, the same quiet solitude that helped him think. But today felt different. Today something had pulled him here, to this exact spot 50 miles from nowhere. The headache started the moment he saw the hatch. Sharp, stabbing pain behind his left eye. The kind he hadn't felt since the accident that had stolen 6 months of his life and left him with gaps in his memory that doctors said might never return. They'd told him he was lucky to be alive after the motorcycle crash, lucky to remember his own name. Jake climbed down the metal ladder into the bunker. His phone's flashlight revealed an underground garage that shouldn't exist. 27 motorcycles sat in perfect rows, each one covered by a tarp that had somehow kept the Montana elements at bay. As he pulled away the first cover, his breath caught. A 1948 Indian Chief, cherry red with chrome that still gleamed despite the years. His fingers traced the fuel tank, and suddenly he could smell burning rubber, hear the roar of engines, feel the adrenaline of a midnight run through city streets. But these weren't his memories, were they? The next bike made his knees weak. A 1957 Harley-Davidson Sportster, customized with ape-hanger handlebars and a paint job he somehow knew had been done by a guy named Cisco in a garage in Oakland. Jake had never been to Oakland. Had he? Each motorcycle he uncovered brought new fragments. A Triumph Bonneville with a dent in the tank from when someone had dropped it during a police chase. A Vincent Black Shadow with nitrous injection that could outrun anything on 4 wheels. These weren't just bikes. They were pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he'd been trying to solve. The engines grew louder outside. Multiple bikes, riding hard, getting closer. Jake's survival instincts kicked in, honed by years of living off the grid, though he'd never understood why he felt the need to stay hidden. Now, standing in this underground tomb of stolen motorcycles, pieces of the answer began falling into place. His reflection caught in the chrome of a nearby headlight, and for a moment he saw someone else. Younger, harder, with scars he'd explained away as accident damage. But what if they weren't from an accident? What if the motorcycle crash had been something else entirely? The sound of boots on gravel made his blood freeze. They'd found the hatch. Jake grabbed a helmet from one of the bikes, a black half-shell with a distinctive red devil painted on the side. The moment his fingers touched it, memory exploded through his skull like a gunshot. Highway 101, 3 in the morning, following a convoy of stolen bikes north, while police sirens wailed behind them. The weight of betrayal in his stomach, the knowledge that he'd sold out his own crew. His name wasn't Jake Martinez, it was Jimmy Ghost Kellerman, and he'd been the best wheelman the Crimson Devils had ever had. Until the night he'd made a choice that had started a war. "Jimmy!" The voice echoed down from above, rough as gravel and familiar as his own heartbeat. "We know you're down there, brother. Time to come home." Ghost, because that's who he really was, looked around the bunker one more time. 27 motorcycles worth more than most people made in a lifetime. His insurance policy, hidden away for the day his memories returned and his past finally caught up with him. That day had come. Above him, shadows moved across the hatch opening. The Crimson Devils had finally found their lost treasure, and their prodigal son had nowhere left to run. The rusted padlock crumbled at Jake's first strike with the tire iron. He'd expected more resistance, but decades of moisture had done most of the work for him. The heavy door groaned on corroded hinges as he pulled it open, releasing a stale breath of air that carried hints of motor oil and something else, something metallic and cold. Jake clicked on his phone's flashlight and stepped into the darkness. The narrow beam revealed concrete steps descending into what appeared to be a sizable underground space. Each footfall echoed with a hollow ring that suggested the bunker extended much deeper than he'd anticipated. At the bottom of the steps, his light swept across a sight that made him forget to breathe. Motorcycles, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows like sleeping beasts. But these weren't ordinary bikes. Even under layers of dust, he could make out the distinctive curves of vintage Indians, the chrome glint of pristine Harley knuckleheads, and what looked like a 1938 Brough Superior gleaming in the shadows. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice absorbed by the concrete walls. Jake moved deeper into the bunker, his light dancing across machines that belonged in museums, not buried in some forgotten hole in the Nevada desert. A 1936 Harley L caught his attention first, the kind of bike that would sell for 6 figures at Barrett-Jackson. Next to it sat a Vincent Black Lightning, its tank badge clearly visible despite the dust. But something felt wrong. The bikes were too clean, too well preserved. No rust, no degradation beyond surface dust. Someone had been maintaining this collection, and recently, his foot kicked something metallic. Jake aimed his light downward and found a modern LED lantern. Still warm, his blood turned to ice water as the implications hit him. Someone else had been here, recently, possibly minutes before he'd arrived. A sound from above made him freeze, the distant rumble of engines growing closer, multiple engines. Jake killed his phone light and listened in the suffocating darkness. The rumble grew louder, then stopped. Car doors slammed, voices carried on the desert wind, too distant to make out words but close enough to spike his adrenaline. He fumbled for his phone again, activating the light but cupping his hand over it to limit the glow. He needed another way out. The bunker had to have a back exit. Places like this always did. Moving as quietly as possible between the rows of motorcycles, he searched the perimeter walls. The voices above grew clearer. At least 3 men, maybe 4. One had an accent, Eastern European, possibly Russian. They were arguing about something, and Jake caught fragments. "Supposed to be here," and 40 years of waiting. Near the back wall, behind a particularly impressive collection of pre-war Indians, Jake found what he was looking for. Another door, this one newer and equipped with a modern lock. But as he approached it, his light caught something that made his stomach clench. Papers scattered across a makeshift desk, maps, photographs, and what looked like police reports. The photographs showed the same motorcycles surrounding him, but in these pictures they were loaded in the back of trucks, being unloaded at what appeared to be a warehouse. The police reports bore dates from 1982, and he could make out enough text to understand they dealt with a major theft. Until now. Footsteps on the stairs above sent Jake scrambling toward the back exit. His hands shook as he examined the lock, a heavy-duty deadbolt that would need a key or serious tools to open, neither of which he possessed. A beam of light cut through the darkness from the entrance, multiple beams actually, sweeping methodically across the bunker. The voices were closer now, speaking in hushed tones, but with an urgency that suggested they weren't here for a casual visit. Jake pressed himself against the wall behind the largest motorcycle, a massive 1941 Indian 4. Through the spokes of its wheels, he watched 3 figures descend into the bunker. They moved with military precision, flashlights mounted on what appeared to be firearms. The man in front was tall and lean, wearing an expensive-looking leather jacket. When he spoke, Jake recognized the accented voice from above. Dmitri said someone was asking questions in Tonopah about old mining claims in this area. The man's light played across the motorcycles with familiar ease. "We should have moved these years ago. 40 years we've kept this secret, Volkov," replied another voice. "These bikes are our retirement fund." Jake's mind raced. These weren't casual thieves. They were the original crew, or what remained of it, and they'd been guarding this collection for 4 decades, waiting for the heat to die down enough to sell. The beam of light swept closer to his hiding spot. The silence in the bunker pressed against Jake's eardrums like a physical weight. He stood frozen at the bottom of the ladder, his flashlight beam dancing across chrome and steel that gleamed despite decades of abandonment. The motorcycles sat in perfect rows, as if their owners had just stepped away for a moment and would return any second. Jake forced himself to breathe. The air was stale but not suffocating, suggesting some kind of ventilation system still functioned down here. He swept his light across the ceiling and spotted the metal ducts, painted the same military green as the concrete walls. Moving deeper into the bunker, he counted 23 motorcycles in total. His hands shook as he approached the closest one, a 1969 Triumph Bonneville in pristine condition. The tank bore the original decals, and when he touched the seat, the leather felt supple under his fingers. Someone had maintained these machines with obsessive care. But maintain for what? And why hide them underground like buried treasure? Jake's light caught something mounted on the far wall, a pegboard covered with keys, each tagged with a number corresponding to the motorcycles. Below it, a metal desk held stacks of paperwork weighed down by a vintage helmet. As he approached, he could make out faded letterheads and what looked like shipping manifests. The top document made his blood run cold. It was a police report dated September 15, 1982, detailing the theft of vintage motorcycles from 3 separate dealerships in Los Angeles. Total value, $2.3 million. In 1982 dollars. Jake flipped through more papers with trembling fingers. Insurance claims, newspaper clippings, FBI case files. Someone had compiled an entire dossier on what the newspapers called the Phantom Rider heist. The thief or thieves had struck 5 dealerships over 2 weeks, making off with only the most valuable vintage bikes. They'd never been caught. A photograph paperclip to one of the FBI reports showed a man in his 40s with dark hair and intense eyes. The caption read, "Vincent Wheels Romano, prime suspect." Jake studied the face, noting the resemblance to his own Italian features, though this man had a hardness around his eyes that spoke of violence. According to the files, Romano had been a known associate of the Torino crime family, specializing in high-end vehicle theft. The FBI suspected he'd orchestrated the motorcycle heist to fund a larger operation, but Romano had vanished before they could arrest him. The case had gone cold. Jake sank into the desk chair, his mind reeling. He was sitting in the middle of one of the biggest unsolved heists in California history. These motorcycles were worth millions today, maybe tens of millions to the right collectors. And if Romano had connections to organized crime, a metallic clang echoed from somewhere above, freezing Jake's thoughts. He killed his flashlight instantly, plunging the bunker into absolute darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he strained to listen. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor above his head. Jake's mind raced. He'd closed the trapdoor behind him but hadn't locked it, hadn't even seen a way to lock it. If someone was searching the cabin, they'd find the entrance eventually. He needed to move. Feeling his way through the darkness, Jake navigated back toward the ladder by memory. The footsteps above had stopped, replaced by the sound of furniture being moved, drawers opening and closing. Someone was conducting a methodical search. Jake's foot knocked against something metal, sending a small tool skittering across the concrete. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. Above, all movement ceased. Then came the unmistakable creak of the trapdoor opening. A beam of light pierced the darkness, sweeping back and forth across the bunker floor. Jake pressed himself behind the nearest motorcycle, a massive Harley-Davidson that provided decent cover. The light moved systematically, professionally, like someone trained in tactical searches. "I know you're down there." The voice was gravelly, patient. "Found your bike outside. Nice Ducati. Shame if something happened to it." Jake's blood turned to ice. Whoever this was, they weren't some random intruder. They knew about motorcycles, knew he was here, and spoke with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to violence. The light continued its sweep as boots descended the ladder. Jake caught a glimpse of the intruder, a tall man in a dark jacket moving with the fluid grace of a predator. In his free hand, something metallic glinted. A gun. "Romano left quite a collection down here," the man continued conversationally. "Took us 40 years to track it down, 40 years of following dead leads and bribing old-timers. You just got lucky, stumbled onto our retirement fund. There were others." Jake's throat felt like sandpaper. These people had been hunting Romano's stash for decades, and he'd accidentally found it on a random ride through the mountains. The irony would have been funny if he wasn't about to die for it. The light swept closer to his hiding spot. In seconds, he'd be exposed. The silence in the bunker felt oppressive as Jake stood among the gleaming motorcycles, his mind racing through possibilities. Each bike represented a fortune, but more importantly, they represented trouble he'd never asked for. His flashlight beam caught the chrome details of a pristine 1952 Vincent Black Shadow, its fuel tank polished to mirror perfection. He needed answers before he made any decisions about what he'd found. Jake methodically searched the bunker for clues about its origins. Behind the motorcycles, he discovered a small office space carved into the rock. A metal desk sat against one wall, its surface thick with dust. The drawers stuck with age, but persistence paid off. Inside the bottom drawer, wrapped in oiled cloth, he found a leather journal and several yellowed newspaper clippings. The newspaper headlines made his blood run cold. "Motorcycle Museum heist leaves guard dead. Police hunt gang responsible for $2 million theft. Vinnie Marconi prime suspect in vintage bike robbery." The dates ranged from August to November 1987. Jake's hands trembled as he opened the journal. The handwriting was careful, methodical. August 15th, 1987. The job went sideways. Lou's dead. The guard wasn't supposed to be there. Vinny says we lay low until the heat dies down. Nobody touches the bikes until we get the all clear. August 22nd, 1987. Cops are sniffing around. Vinny thinks someone talked, moving the bikes to the cache tomorrow night. September 3rd, 1987. Safe in the bunker. Vinny's getting paranoid. Thinks Russo's crew is hunting us. Maybe he's right. The entries stopped abruptly after September 10th. Jake flipped through empty pages, finding nothing more. One newspaper article included photos of the stolen motorcycles. Jake compared them to the bikes around him. Every single one matched. 15 vintage motorcycles, stolen from the Morrison Classic Motorcycle Museum in Philadelphia 36 years ago. The theft had left a security guard dead, and the perpetrators vanished without a trace. According to the articles, Vincent Marconi had been the prime suspect, but his body turned up in the Delaware River 3 weeks after the heist. The other gang members, Tony Castellano and Lou Brennan, had simply disappeared. Lou was apparently the one who'd died during the robbery itself. That left Tony Castellano unaccounted for. Jake photographed the newspaper clippings with his phone, though he had no signal this deep underground. The implications of his discovery were becoming clearer and more dangerous by the minute. If Tony Castellano was still alive, he'd be in his 70s now, but that didn't mean he'd given up on recovering his stolen fortune. And there could be others, associates, family members, rival criminals who'd spent decades hunting for this exact cache. As he prepared to leave, Jake noticed something he'd missed earlier. Near the bunker's entrance, partially hidden behind supply crates, sat a small motorcycle he hadn't seen in his initial sweep. This one was different. Newer, probably from the early 2000s. It wore a thick coat of dust, but was clearly more recent than the stolen vintage bikes. Someone had been here long after the 1987 heist. Jake's pulse quickened as he examined the newer bike more closely. The key was still in the ignition. A helmet hung from the handlebars, and in the storage compartment he found a wallet. The driver's license belonged to Marcus Anthony Castellano, born 1981. The resemblance to the mugshot of Tony Castellano from the newspaper was unmistakable. Same eyes, same nose, though younger. A son, or grandson. The license had expired 5 years ago. Jake's mind raced through scenarios. Had Marcus found the bunker and met with an accident? Or had someone else found him here first? Either way, the presence of Marcus's bike proved that others knew about this place. Jake made his decision quickly. He couldn't stay here any longer, and he couldn't ignore what he'd found. But he also couldn't just walk away and pretend none of this existed. The stolen motorcycles represented history, evidence of an unsolved murder case. The families of the security guard deserved justice, even after all these years. But first, he needed to get out safely. Jake retraced his steps to the bunker entrance, listening carefully for any sounds from above. The forest remained quiet. As he climbed the hidden ladder, he realized he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The moment he'd opened that concealed hatch, he'd become part of a decades-old mystery that others might kill to keep buried. At ground level, Jake carefully replaced the camouflaged cover. From the surface, the bunker's entrance was completely invisible. He could walk away right now, leave everything buried, and nobody would ever know he'd been here. Instead, he started hiking back toward his motorcycle, mind churning with plans. He had evidence of a major unsolved crime, but he also had a target painted on his back the moment anyone realized he knew about the bunker's existence. The smart play was to contact the police immediately. The question was whether he'd live long enough to make that call. The rain drummed against Jake's apartment windows as he spread the contents of the duffel bag across his kitchen table. 3 stacks of yellow documents, a handful of black and white photographs, and what appeared to be detailed maps of the southwestern United States. The musty smell of decades-old paper filled the small room. He picked up the first photograph, squinting at the grainy image. 5 men stood beside an armored truck, their faces partially obscured by shadows and the poor quality of the film. One figure caught his attention, a tall man with distinctive facial scarring leaning against the truck's rear doors. Something about his posture suggested authority, like he was the one calling the shots. The maps were more revealing. Red X marks dotted locations across Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. Some had dates penciled beside them, ranging from 1962 to 1967. Notes in cramped handwriting filled the margins. Guards changed at 2 a.m. Back road clear Thursday mornings, inside man confirmed. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a newspaper clipping from the Phoenix Herald, dated September 15, 1967. The headline read, "Armored car robbery nets thieves $2.30 million. Below it, a smaller article detailed the disappearance of the 5-man crew suspected of the heist. According to the report, they'd vanished without a trace, along with their stolen fortune. $2.3 million. In 1967 money. His phone buzzed. A text from his buddy Mike. "Drink tonight? You've been MIA for days." Jake ignored it, too absorbed in the documents. A folded blueprint caught his eye. Architectural plans for what looked like a bank vault system. Handwritten notes indicated security camera blind spots and guard rotation schedules. These weren't amateurs. They'd planned everything down to the smallest detail. Another photograph showed the same 5 men, this time standing in front of motorcycles. Jake recognized the bikes immediately. The same vintage Harleys and Triumphs now sitting in the underground bunker. The scarred man straddled a 1965 Electra Glide, the same bike Jake had been admiring just hours earlier. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the implications. Those motorcycles weren't just hidden, they were evidence. The bunker wasn't a collector's secret stash, it was a tomb preserving the final chapter of an unsolved crime. He found a handwritten letter tucked between the maps, the ink faded but still legible. "Tommy, if you're reading this, something went wrong. The heat's too much. Rossini's boys are closing in, and word is they've got inside information. The bikes and the goods are safe where we discussed. Remember the stories my grandfather told about the old mine shafts? Follow the creek bed 3 miles past Devil's Backbone. You'll know the place when you see it. The combination is Sarah's birthday. You remember. Keep your head down and wait for things to cool off. If I don't make contact within 6 months, it's all yours. Vincent." Jake's mouth went dry. Rossini. He'd heard that name before, whispered in the same breath as stories about organized crime families that had controlled parts of the Southwest during the 60s and 70s. If Vincent and his crew had stolen from the Rossini organization, they hadn't just robbed an armored car, they'd declared war on the mob. He searched through more documents, finding bank records, safety deposit box keys, and what appeared to be insurance documents for the motorcycles. Everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. The final item in the bag made his blood freeze. A recent photograph, obviously taken with a digital camera and printed on modern photo paper. It showed the entrance to the bunker, his bunker, with a timestamp from just 3 days ago. Someone else knew about the location. On the back of the photo, fresh handwriting in black ink, "Vincent's dead, Tommy's dead. Time to collect what's ours. Ah." Jake's hands shook as he set the photograph down. 3 days ago, he'd been planning his weekend ride, completely unaware that he was about to stumble into a 50-year-old manhunt. Someone with the initial R, possibly connected to the Rossini family, had been watching the bunker, waiting. But waiting for what? Had they been unable to access it without the proper combination? Or were they using it as bait, hoping to catch anyone who might lead them to additional hidden assets? Thunder crashed outside and Jake jumped. Every shadow in his apartment seemed menacing now. He gathered the documents, shoving them back into the bag. The smart move would be to burn everything and pretend he'd never found the bunker. But $2.3 million, even split with unknown partners or adjusted for inflation, represented more money than he'd see in a lifetime of construction work. And those motorcycles alone were worth a fortune to the right collectors. His phone buzzed again. This time, an unknown number. "We should meet. You have something that belongs to us." Jake stared at the message, his heart hammering against his ribs. They knew who he was. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jake pushed his eggs around his plate, appetite gone. 3 cups of coffee hadn't cleared the fog from his mind, and every sound, the clink of silverware, the hiss of the grill, the door chime, made him jump. He'd barely slept, images of those pristine motorcycles haunting his dreams, alongside questions that multiplied like weeds. "You look like hell, hun." The waitress, Dolores according to her name tag, refilled his cup without being asked. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the weathered face of someone who'd seen plenty of trouble come and go. "Rough night," Jake muttered, forcing a smile. "Bike trouble? Saw you roll in on that Harley. Sweet ride." Something like that. He pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages while actually studying reflection in the black screen. Nobody had followed him from the quarry, but paranoia was becoming his new default setting. Dolores lingered, clearly wanting to chat, but Jake's attention drifted to the television mounted in the corner. The morning news was cycling through local stories, a ribbon cutting at the new shopping center, high school football scores, weather, then a story that made his blood freeze. Local historian Margaret Chen continues her research into the infamous 1987 Blackstone Museum heist. The anchor announced over file footage of a stately brick building. Chen believes the thieves may have had inside knowledge of the museum's security systems and vintage motorcycle collection. Jake's fork clattered against his plate. The reporter continued, but her words became distant noise as his mind raced. 1987, the same year etched on that newspaper clipping in the bunker. This couldn't be coincidence. He threw a 20 on the table and headed for the door, ignoring Dolores's concerned call. Outside, the morning air bit at his face as he fired up the Harley and pulled into traffic. The Blackstone Museum was only 40 minutes away in the city, but it felt like the longest ride of his life. The museum sat in the Arts District, its neoclassical facade imposing even in daylight. Jake parked across the street, studying the building while trying to look casual. Security cameras tracked the entrance, and a guard was visible through the glass doors. Whatever had happened here 35 years ago, they were still taking precautions. Inside, the lobby was all marble and hushed reverence. Jake approached the information desk where a young man with perfectly styled hair looked up expectantly. "I'm interested in learning about the 1987 break-in," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm writing a book about unsolved crimes." The clerk's expression shifted slightly. "You'll want to speak with Dr. Chen. She's our resident expert on that particular incident." He picked up a phone. "Margaret, there's someone here asking about the Blackstone heist." "Yes, another one." "Another one." Jake filed that detail away as the clerk directed him to the third floor. The elevator ride gave him time to rehearse his story, but when the doors opened and he saw Dr. Chen waiting, all his preparation evaporated. She was older than he'd expected from the news footage, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail about him. Her handshake was firm, businesslike. "Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison." "Well, Mr. Morrison, you're the fourth person this month to ask about the heist. Either there's a sudden surge of interest in 35-year-old crimes, or something stirred the pot." She led him down a corridor lined with display cases. "Which is it?" Jake's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I've been studying this case for 15 years. The pattern is always the same. Long stretches of nothing, then suddenly everyone wants to know about missing motorcycles and dead thieves." She stopped at a display case containing photographs and newspaper clippings. "Usually means someone's found something." The photos showed the crime scene aftermath, empty display platforms, shattered glass, broken security equipment. But it was the list of stolen items that made Jake's mouth go dry. 12 vintage motorcycles, including a 1948 Indian Chief and a 1952 Vincent Black Shadow. Exact matches for what he'd seen in the bunker. "They never recovered anything," Dr. Chen continued, watching his face carefully. 4 men dead, 1 missing, and not a single bike ever surfaced. 22 million in stolen merchandise just vanished. The missing man? Tommy Volkov. Low-level muscle for the Torino crime family. Most people assume he's dead too, but his body never turned up. She leaned closer. "The working theory is that he double-crossed his partners, killed them, and disappeared with the haul. But I have a different idea." Jake forced himself to maintain eye contact. "Which is, I think Tommy Volkov was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. I think he hid those bikes somewhere safe and planned to wait until the heat died down. But something went wrong. Maybe he got killed by rivals, maybe he just died of natural causes. Either way, those motorcycles are still out there waiting." The weight of the bunker keys in Jake's pocket felt enormous. Around them, the museum hummed with quiet activity, tourists and school groups moving through exhibits, oblivious to the fact that one of the biggest unsolved heists in state history might have just been cracked. The chrome badge gleamed under Jake's flashlight beam, its surface worn but unmistakably authentic. Vincent Scaramelli. He'd heard whispers of that name in biker circles, old-timers who spoke in hushed tones about the man who'd supposedly owned half the underground racing scene in the 70s before vanishing without a trace. Jake's hands trembled as he photographed the badge with his phone, the camera flash illuminating the Ducati's pristine red tank. According to local legend, Scaramelli had connections that ran deeper than anyone imagined, ties to organizations that didn't forgive debts or forget betrayals. If these bikes belonged to him, Jake had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple theft. The bunker suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. He needed to think clearly, rationally, Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide these machines, and the military-grade security suggested they expected trouble. Big trouble. A metallic scraping echoed from somewhere above, freezing Jake's blood. He killed the flashlight instantly, plunging the bunker into absolute darkness. The sound came again, deliberate, methodical. Footsteps on metal grating. Jake crouched behind the nearest motorcycle, forcing himself to breathe slowly and silently. His mind raced through possibilities. Had someone followed him? Were there motion sensors he'd missed? The entrance had seemed abandoned, but maybe that was exactly the point. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Jake counted his heartbeats. 10, 20, 30 seconds of perfect silence. Then a new sound, the distinctive whir of electric motors. The ceiling began to shift, panels sliding away to reveal a much larger opening than the service hatch he'd used. Bright lead floodlights blazed to life, turning night into harsh day. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, seeing spots dance behind his eyelids. When his vision cleared, 3 figures descended on a mechanical platform, their faces hidden behind tactical masks. "Well, well," the center figure spoke, his voice carrying a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "Looks like our little mouse finally found the cheese." Jake remained perfectly still, hoping the vintage machines would provide enough cover. The men spread out with practiced efficiency, checking corners and examining the bikes with obvious familiarity. These weren't random thieves or curious trespassers. They knew exactly what they were looking for. 37 years, the leader continued, running his gloved hand along a motorcycle's seat. 37 years we've been watching this place, waiting for someone stupid enough or brave enough to breach our security. Tell me, Mouse, which are you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake's grip tightened on his phone, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. But who would he call? The police wouldn't arrive in time, and explaining his presence here would raise questions he couldn't answer. A silent treatment? The leader chuckled. How disappointing. Miguel, start the bikes, one by one. Our friend will reveal himself when he realizes what we're about to do. One of the masked men moved toward the nearest motorcycle, producing a jerry can from somewhere. The sharp smell of gasoline filled the air, and Jake's stomach lurched. They were going to destroy everything, the bikes, the evidence, and probably him along with it. Such a waste, the leader mused, watching his companion douse the vintage machines. These beauties survived Vietnam, the mob wars of the 80s, even that unfortunate business with the Federal Task Force. But all things must end. Jake's mind raced. The mention of Vietnam and Federal Task Forces painted a clearer picture. This wasn't just about stolen motorcycles. It was about a network that had been operating for decades, using these machines as some kind of currency or collateral. The bunker wasn't a garage, it was a vault. The gasoline smell grew stronger, making Jake's eyes water. He had maybe minutes before they lit the place up. His phone showed no signal down here, and even if he could call for help, no one would arrive in time. He was on his own. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake began working his way toward the platform they descended on. If he could reach it, maybe disable the controls or at least get to higher ground, he might have a chance. The men were focused on their systematic destruction, confident that their prey was trapped. You know what the real tragedy is? The leader continued his monologue while his companions prepared their bonfire. Vincent thought he was so clever, hiding his insurance policy down here. He never imagined we'd let it sit untouched all these years, using it as bait for exactly this moment. Jake froze. Bait. They'd been using the bunker as a trap, waiting for someone to discover it. But why? What could possibly be worth such an elaborate setup? The answer hit him like ice water. He wasn't the first person to find this place. The coffee shop on Elm Street buzzed with the usual morning crowd, but Jake kept his eyes fixed on the newspaper spread before him, using it as cover while he watched the entrance. Sarah had chosen well, plenty of exits, good visibility, and enough ambient noise to mask their conversation. She slid into the booth across from him at exactly 9. her face pale but determined. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said without preamble, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug. "About my grandfather's connection to this whole mess." Jake folded the newspaper, studying her carefully. "And I want to see the bunker." "Absolutely not." The words came out sharper than he'd intended. "It's too dangerous. These people killed Vincent, and they're still out there." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. My grandfather didn't just work for the Torino family, he was family. Antonio Torino was my great-uncle. I grew up hearing stories about Uncle Tony's legitimate businesses, his contributions to the community. The criminal side was always hushed up, treated like ugly rumors." Jake's blood chilled. If Sarah was connected to the Torino bloodline, it explained why the current players were so interested in her. "Does anyone else know about this connection?" "I don't think so. My mother changed her name when she married, and we never talked about that side of the family openly." She paused, taking a shaky sip of coffee. "But there's something else. I remembered why my grandfather's workshop always smelled like motor oil and leather. He used to restore vintage motorcycles as a hobby. He'd disappear for hours down there, working on these beautiful old machines." The pieces clicked together in Jake's mind like tumblers in a lock. He wasn't just the inside man on the heist. He was hiding the bikes in plain sight, restoring them one by one, making them disappear into the legitimate collector market. Sarah finished. But something went wrong. Jake nodded grimly. The heat got too intense, or maybe he got paranoid. So he moved everything to the bunker and waited for things to cool down. Only he died before he could retrieve them. Their conversation was interrupted by Jake's phone buzzing against the table. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "You've got something that belongs to us." The voice was gravelly, older, with the slight accent of someone who'd spent decades in the city. Jake's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number." "Cut the shit, Mitchell. We know you found Tony's stash. More importantly, we know you've been talking to the old man's granddaughter." Across the table, Sarah's face went white as she registered Jake's expression. He forced himself to remain calm, scanning the coffee shop for threats. "What do you want?" "Simple exchange. The bikes for your continued breathing." "There's a warehouse at 1247 Industrial Boulevard. Be there at midnight and bring everything you took from the bunker." "And if I refuse?" A dry chuckle came through the speaker. "Take a look out the window, tough guy." Jake's blood turned to ice as he spotted the black sedan parked across the street, two figures visible in the front seats. The passenger lifted a phone to his ear and waved. "Don't do anything stupid," the voice continued. "We've got people watching both of you. Try to run, try to call the cops, and this gets messy real quick. Midnight. Don't be late." The line went dead. Sarah grabbed his arm. "What did they say?" Jake pocketed the phone, his mind racing through options. "We need to leave, now, but act natural." They stood slowly, Sarah leaving money on the table for their untouched coffee. Jake guided her toward the back exit, using the service corridor that led to the alley behind the shop. His motorcycle was parked 3 blocks away. He'd learned to vary his routes and parking spots. "They want to make a trade," he explained as they walked, keeping their pace casual despite every instinct screaming at him to run. "The bike's for our lives. You're going to give them what they want?" Jake almost laughed at the irony. "I can't. I moved the bikes yesterday, right after I left your place. Call it paranoia, but I had a feeling that Bunker was compromised." They reached his bike, and Jake handed Sarah the spare helmet. "Where did you move them?" "Storage unit across town. But here's the thing. I only moved half of them. The other half are still down there, along with a few surprises I rigged up." He kicked the engine to life. "These guys think they're walking into a simple pickup. They're about to learn that some treasures come with a price." Sarah climbed on behind him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "What's the plan?" Jake pulled into traffic, checking his mirrors for the sedan. "We're going to give them exactly what they asked for, just not the way they expect." The engine roared as they disappeared into the maze of city streets, and Jake began calculating how much explosive potential a few gallons of gasoline and some old motorcycle parts could generate. The pre-dawn darkness felt like a shroud as Jake crept through the industrial district, his footsteps echoing off empty warehouses. He ditched his bike 6 blocks away, paranoid that its rumble might give him away. The weight of Markowski's confession still pressed on his chest like a physical burden. 37 people dead because of those bikes sitting in his grandfather's bunker. Blood money on 2 wheels. He approached the auto shop from the rear, slipping through shadows cast by rusted fire escapes and overflowing dumpsters. The plan was simple. Get inside, photograph everything he could find about the Crimson Devils and their connection to the heist, then disappear before anyone knew he'd been there. Simple plans, he reminded himself, had a way of going sideways fast. The back door's lock yielded to his picks after 5 tense minutes. Jake had learned the skill during a rebellious phase in high school, never imagining it would prove useful for breaking into his grandfather's secrets. The door swung open with a barely audible creak. Inside, the familiar smell of motor oil and metal shavings greeted him, but something felt different, wrong. The usual organized chaos of tools and parts seemed too neat, as if someone had recently searched through everything. Jake's pulse quickened as he pulled out his phone's flashlight, keeping the beam low. He moved toward the office, remembering the filing cabinets Gramps had always kept locked. If there were records connecting him to the Riverside job, they'd be there. The office door stood ajar, which immediately set off alarm bells. His grandfather had been obsessive about locking that door. Jake stepped inside and nearly stumbled over an overturned chair. His flashlight revealed the office had been thoroughly ransacked. File drawers hung open, papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Someone had beaten him here. Looking for something specific? Jake's blood turned to ice. He spun toward the voice, his light illuminating a figure sitting calmly in the corner. The man was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and eyes that reflected the light like a predator's. He wore an expensive suit that looked out of place in the grimy shop. "You must be Jake," the man continued, his voice carrying a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "Thomas Crenshaw's grandson. You have his eyes." "Who are you?" Jake managed, his mouth suddenly dry. "Someone who's been looking for your grandfather's collection for a very long time. My name is Victor Kozlov." The name hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Even Markowski had spoken it in whispers. "I understand you've made quite a discovery recently." Jake's mind raced. How could Kozlov know about the bunker? He'd told no one except Sarah, and she wouldn't. His blood chilled as another possibility occurred to him. "Where's Sarah?" Kozlov smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Safe for now. Lovely girl. Very loyal to you. It took considerable persuasion to get her to reveal where you might be tonight." Rage flooded through Jake, temporarily overriding his fear. "If you hurt her..." "You'll what?" Kozlov stood slowly, and Jake noticed the gun holstered beneath his jacket. "You're hardly in a position to make threats, young man. You have something that belongs to me, and I intend to collect it. Those bikes don't belong to you. They're stolen." "Indeed they are. Stolen by your grandfather and his associates from my employer 37 years ago." Kozlov's eyes hardened, along with something far more valuable than vintage motorcycles. Jake's confusion must have shown on his face because Kozlov chuckled. "You really don't know, do you? Your grandfather never told you about the real prize. The bikes were just camouflage, boy. Window dressing for the main event. What are you talking about? Hidden in one of those beautiful machines is something worth $50 million today, industrial diamonds, military grade, stolen from a Soviet military convoy and sold to the highest bidder. My employer paid handsomely for those stones, only to have them disappear into the American underground." The pieces began clicking into place. No wonder Kozlov had spent decades hunting for the collection. No wonder people kept dying. This wasn't about vintage motorcycles at all. "I don't know anything about diamonds," Jake said. "Perhaps not. But you know where the bikes are." Kozlov moved closer, and Jake caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker. "And you're going to take me there? Tonight? And if I refuse?" Kozlov pulled out his phone and showed Jake a photo that made his knees go weak. Sarah, bound and gagged in what looked like a warehouse, terror clear in her eyes. "Then Miss Chen will pay the price for your stubbornness. And trust me, I have very creative ways of extracting information." Jake stared at the photo, his hands shaking. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but Sarah's life hung in the balance. The treasure in his grandfather's bunker had already claimed too many victims. "What guarantee do I have that you'll let her go?" "None whatsoever. But cooperation will certainly improve her chances of survival." The warehouse district felt like a graveyard at 3 in the morning. Jake killed the Harley's engine 2 blocks away from Torino's auto salvage, letting momentum carry him into the shadows between 2 abandoned buildings. The silence pressed against his eardrums, broken only by the distant hum of highway traffic. He'd spent the last 4 hours preparing for this moment. The duffel bag slung across his shoulder contained everything Elena had demanded: detailed photographs of the bunker's interior, precise GPS coordinates, and most importantly, the original shipping manifests he'd found tucked behind a rusted tool cabinet. The documents that proved beyond doubt that the Vincent Black Lightning collection had indeed been stolen from a private collector in Monaco 60 years ago. But Jake had kept something back. Hidden in his jacket pocket was a single photograph he hadn't included in Elena's package, one showing a motorcycle she hadn't mentioned during their tense negotiation. A 1951 Munch Mammoth that shouldn't have existed, since the prototype had supposedly been destroyed in a factory fire. If Elena was willing to kill for the Vincent collection, this particular bike would be worth dying for. The salvage yard's chain-link fence stretched into the darkness, topped with coils of razor wire that gleamed like silver teeth under the security lights. Jake had scouted the perimeter earlier, noting the gaps in surveillance coverage and the rusted section of fencing near the back office where someone could slip through undetected. A car door slammed somewhere in the distance. Jake froze, every nerve ending suddenly alert. Too early for Elena's scheduled arrival. He pressed himself against the brick wall and waited, counting heartbeats. Footsteps echoed off the pavement, accompanied by low voices, multiple people, moving with purpose. Jake's blood turned to ice water as he recognized one of the voices, Tommy the Wrench Castellano, whose reputation for creative violence was legendary even among the criminal underworld. Elena had brought backup, serious backup. The original plan crumbled in his mind like wet paper. He'd intended to make the exchange, take the money, and disappear into the night with enough cash to start fresh somewhere far away. But Castellano's presence changed everything. Elena wasn't planning to let him walk away from this transaction. Jake slipped deeper into the shadows, his mind racing through options. The smart move would be to cut his losses, abandon the meeting and run. But 48 hours ago, Elena had demonstrated exactly how long her reach extended when she'd cornered him at the diner 50 miles from home. Running would only delay the inevitable. The voices grew closer. Jake could make out Elena's crisp pronunciation beneath the men's rougher tones. 3 people minimum, possibly 4, all between him and his motorcycle. A new sound cut through the night, the distinctive rumble of a powerful engine approaching fast. Jake's breath caught as he recognized the note. A Vincent Black Shadow, perfectly tuned and running hard. Someone else had arrived at the party. The engine noise stopped abruptly, replaced by the squeal of brakes and the crunch of boots on gravel. A door slammed, followed by Elena's voice, sharp with surprise and anger. "You weren't invited to this conversation, Marcus." Marcus. Jake's mind conjured the image of the grizzled mechanic who'd tried to warn him away from the bunker 3 days ago. The old man had claimed he was just looking out for a fellow biker, but Jake was beginning to suspect there was more to Marcus than met the eye. "Neither were your friends," Marcus replied, his gravelly voice carrying clearly in the still air. "This was supposed to be a simple exchange." "Plans change," Elena said coldly. The boy knows too much. He's seen too much. The boy's under my protection now. Jake heard the metallic click of a weapon being cocked, then another. The temperature in the alley seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're outnumbered, old man." Castellano's voice was a low growl. "Walk away while you still can." Marcus chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Tommy, you always were too stupid to count properly." The night erupted in chaos. Engines roared to life from multiple directions as powerful motorcycles emerged from concealment around the salvage yard. Jake counted at least 6 different exhaust notes, each one distinct and aggressive. Marcus hadn't come alone either. Shouts echoed between the buildings as Elena's group found themselves surrounded. Jake pressed himself against the wall, trying to make sense of the developing situation. Whatever was happening here went far deeper than a simple artifact recovery. This felt like the culmination of something that had been building for decades. A hand grabbed his shoulder from behind. Jake spun around, fists raised, to find himself face to face with a woman wearing motorcycle leathers and a grim expression. "Time to go, kid," she said quietly. "Marcus wants to talk to you about what you really found in that bunker." The warehouse door groaned shut behind them as Marcus led Vega deeper into the shadows. The scent of motor oil and rust hung heavy in the air, mixing with something else, something that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. This wasn't just any abandoned building, this was a trap. "You know, Marcus," Vega said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, "I've been thinking about our conversation. About trust." He gestured for 2 of his men to flank the exits while keeping his pistol trained on Marcus. "See, the thing about trust is that it requires honesty. And you, my friend, haven't been entirely honest with me." Marcus kept his hands visible, his mind racing through possible escape routes. The warehouse was massive, filled with shipping containers and machinery that cast long shadows in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. "I told you everything I know about the bunker." "Did you?" Vega's smile was cold. "Because my sources tell me you've been asking questions around town, talking to old-timers about the Castellano family, about what really happened in 1987. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd suspected the connection, but hearing it confirmed sent ice through his veins. The Castellanos had been one of the most ruthless crime families on the East Coast before they'd mysteriously disappeared overnight. The FBI had found blood but never bodies. "So you do know," Vega continued, reading Marcus's expression. "Good. That saves us some time. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to take me to that bunker, and you're going to help me recover what the Castellanos stole from my family. What they killed my brother for." "Your brother?" "Tony Moretti. Maybe you've heard of him? He was Castellano's right hand until he decided to grow a conscience." Vega's knuckles whitened around his weapon. "They put 3 bullets in his head and dumped him in the harbor, but not before they tortured him for the location of their stash house." Marcus's mind reeled. The motorcycles weren't just vintage bikes. They were the getaway vehicles from the biggest art heist in Boston history. The Castellanos had robbed the Whitmore Museum, making off with over $50 million worth of paintings and artifacts. The FBI had recovered some of it, but the majority had vanished along with the family. "The bikes were just transportation," Marcus said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "The real treasure is what they carried." "Very good. Hidden compartments, specially designed to carry rolled paintings and small artifacts. My grandfather commissioned those modifications himself." Vega stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with decades of suppressed rage. "The Castellanos were supposed to hold the merchandise for 6 months, then split the profits. Instead, they got greedy." A sound from the shadows made both men freeze. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, echoing from somewhere deep in the warehouse. Vega's men immediately shifted their positions, weapons drawn. "Expecting company?" Vega whispered. Before Marcus could answer, a voice called out from the darkness. "Vincent Moretti, I was wondering when you'd finally surface." The voice was older, gravelly, with the unmistakable accent of someone who'd grown up on the streets of South Boston. Marcus recognized it immediately, Detective Ray Sullivan, the cop who'd been asking questions at Murphy's bar. "Sullivan," Vega hissed. "You should have stayed retired, old man." "Couldn't do that. Not when young punks like you start digging up old graves." Sullivan stepped into the light, and Marcus saw he wasn't alone. 3 other men flanked him, all carrying the kind of hardware that suggested this wasn't a police operation. "You see, Marcus," Sullivan continued, his gun now trained on Vega, "Vincent here isn't the only one with family connections to this mess. My partner was killed during the Whitmore investigation, shot in the back by someone feeding information to the Castellanos. The warehouse had become a Mexican standoff with Marcus caught in the middle. Vega's men had their weapons trained on Sullivan's crew, while Sullivan himself seemed focused entirely on Vega. The air crackled with tension, everyone waiting for someone else to make the first move. "The location of that bunker dies with me if any of you pull those triggers," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence. "And from what I'm hearing, I'm the only one who actually knows how to find it again." It was a bluff, but a calculated one. The truth was, Marcus had memorized every detail of the route, every landmark that had led him to the hidden entrance. But these men didn't know that. Vega's eyes narrowed. "You think you're clever, playing us against each other?" "I think I'm trying to stay alive long enough to figure out what's really going on here." Marcus looked between the 2 groups of armed men. "Because something tells me this story goes deeper than a 40-year-old heist." Sullivan's laugh was bitter. "Kid, you don't know the half of it." The warehouse felt like a tomb when Jack slipped through the loading dock door at 3 in the morning. His boots echoed against concrete as he made his way toward the office where Vincent Torino waited. The old man sat behind a metal desk, cigarette smoke curling around his weathered face in the dim light of a single bulb. "You came," Vincent said, not looking up from the photograph he was studying. Jack recognized it immediately, one of the vintage Harleys from the bunker. "You made it sound like I had a choice." Vincent finally raised his eyes. "There's always a choice, kid. The question is whether you're smart enough to make the right one." He slid the photograph across the desk. "Beautiful machines, aren't they? Worth more than most people see in a lifetime." Jack remained standing, every muscle tense. "What do you want?" "What I've wanted for 37 years. What was taken from me." Vincent's voice carried the weight of decades. "Those bikes weren't just stolen. They were my retirement, my legacy. Carlos Mendez and his crew thought they were clever, hiding them away like buried treasure. Mendez is dead. Dead men tell no tales, as they say, but their secrets have a way of surfacing." Vincent stubbed out his cigarette. "Like you surfacing in my city, asking questions about vintage motorcycles." Jack's hand instinctively moved toward the knife on his belt, but Vincent chuckled. "Relax. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have made it through that door." The old man leaned back in his chair. "I want to make a deal. I'm listening. You know where my bikes are. I know you've seen them, touched them, maybe even fired one up to hear that sweet engine purr." Vincent's eyes glittered. "You take me there. I reclaim what's mine, and you walk away with enough money to buy your own fleet." Jack studied the man's face, looking for deception. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll discover that some debts pass from father to son. Your old man crossed paths with my organization more than once. Nothing personal, just business that was never quite settled." The mention of his father sent ice through Jack's veins. He'd suspected there were things about the old man's past he'd never known, but this confirmed it. What kind of business? The kind that ended with him owing favors he never repaid. Consider this an opportunity to clear the family ledger. Jack's mind raced. The bunker's location was his only bargaining chip, but he was beginning to realize he'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple heist. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" Vincent opened a desk drawer and withdrew a thick envelope. "Down payment. Enough to show I'm serious." He tossed it across the desk. "The rest comes when I have my property." Jack didn't touch the envelope. "What about Marcus Chen? He seems pretty interested in those bikes too." Chen Vincent spat the name like it tasted bitter. That ambitious snake thinks he can waltz into my territory and claim what's mine. He's been sniffing around this score for years, ever since his father tried to muscle in on Mendez's operation. So, this is about more than stolen motorcycles. Everything's about more than it appears, kid. Those bikes represent power, respect, territory. In this business, symbols matter as much as substance. Vincent stood, his frame still imposing despite his age. Chen thinks youth and brutality can overcome experience and patience. He's wrong. Jack felt the walls closing in, Chen on one side, Vincent on the other, and somewhere in between, Detective Sarah Morrison piecing together a puzzle that could destroy them all. What happens to me after you get what you want? That depends on how smart you are. Take the money, disappear for a while, start fresh somewhere else. Or stick around and watch two old dogs fight over a bone. Vincent moved to the window, gazing out at the empty street. But understand this, with or without your help, I'm getting those bikes. Your cooperation just determines whether you profit or become collateral damage. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Jack knew he was balanced on a knife's edge. Every choice led down a darker path, but standing still wasn't an option anymore. I need time to think. Time's a luxury you don't have. Chen's getting desperate, which makes him dangerous. The longer those bikes sit hidden, the more likely someone else finds them first. Vincent returned to his chair. 24 hours, kid. Then I start collecting on your father's debt with interest. Jack turned toward the door, leaving the envelope on the desk. As he reached the exit, Vincent's voice followed him into the darkness. Your father was a good man who made bad choices. Don't repeat his mistakes. The loading dock slammed shut behind Jack, but the old man's words echoed in his mind as he walked into the pre-dawn gloom, knowing that time was running out. The Kawasaki's engine screamed as Jake pushed it beyond its limits, the speedometer needle dancing past 90 on the winding mountain road. Behind him, the SUV's headlights grew larger in his mirrors, and he could hear the distant thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the night air. His phone buzzed against his chest. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece over the wind noise. "Jake, I've got bad news. Marcus Chen is dead." The words hit him like a physical blow, nearly causing him to miss the next curve. "What? When?" 2 hours ago. Made to look like a heart attack, but I ran some quick tests on tissue samples. Succinylcholine. It's a paralytic that mimics cardiac arrest. These people are cleaning house fast. Jake downshifted aggressively, taking a hairpin turn that sent gravel spraying into the darkness. The SUV was gaining ground on the straightaways, its powerful engine compensating for its driver's lack of motorcycle road skills. But the helicopter was the real problem. It could track him no matter how many turns he took. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I found something in Chen's effects before they sanitized his apartment, a safety deposit box key and an address. I think he left us something. Sarah, you need to get out of there. Now. If they killed Chen, already gone. I'm at the address Chen left. It's an old storage facility downtown. Jake, you need to see what's in here." The helicopter's spotlight suddenly blazed to life, turning night into harsh day as it swept across the asphalt ahead of him. Jake killed his headlight and veered onto a dirt trail that branched off into the forest. The Kawasaki bucked and protested as it hit the uneven terrain, but the trees provided cover from the air. He could hear the SUV slide to a stop on the main road behind him, doors slamming as its occupants gave chase on foot. Their voices echoed through the woods. Professional, coordinated, lethal. "Talk to me, Sarah. What did Chen leave?" "Files. Lots of them. Financial records, photographs, correspondence. Jake, the 1987 heist wasn't just about the motorcycles. Those bikes were carrying something. Cocaine, hidden in modified fuel tanks. $40 million worth. That explained everything. The vintage motorcycles weren't just valuable collectibles, they were mules in the largest drug smuggling operation of the 80s. Someone had hijacked the shipment, and the original owners had been searching for it ever since. Jake killed the engine and let the bike coast down a steep embankment, using gravity and momentum to stay quiet. The helicopter's rotor wash bent the trees above him as it circled, its searchlight probing the canopy. "The original owner was Vincent Torino," Sarah whispered, as if afraid someone might overhear. "He ran distribution for the Castellano crime family. When the bikes disappeared, it cost him everything. He went to prison for tax evasion in 1989, but he got out 3 years ago." Jake's blood ran cold. Vincent Torino was a legend in organized crime circles, a man who never forgot a debt and never forgave a betrayal. If he was behind the current hunt for the bunker, Jake was in deeper trouble than he'd imagined. The sound of boots crashing through underbrush grew closer. Jake abandoned the motorcycle and started moving on foot, staying low and using the darkness to his advantage. His phone's screen cast an eerie blue glow as Sarah sent him photographs from Chen's files. The first image showed the bunker as it had appeared in 1987. Not the forgotten tomb Jake had discovered, but an active operation. Men in expensive suits stood beside the motorcycles, supervising as workers removed panels from the fuel tanks. In the background, Jake could make out stacks of white packages. The second photograph made his heart stop. A younger Vincent Torino stood in the center of the group, but beside him was a face Jake recognized. Frank Morrison, the old-timer from Murphy's Garage, who'd seemed so interested in Jake's story about finding vintage bikes. "Sarah, I need you to run background on Frank Morrison. Works at Murphy's Custom Cycles in Riverside, already ahead of you. Frank Morrison died in 2019. Whoever you met was using his identity." The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. The man at Murphy's Garage hadn't been a curious old mechanic, he'd been reconnaissance. Jake had walked right into their hands, told them everything about the bunker's location and contents. Voices called out in the darkness, closer now. Jake could smell cigarette smoke and hear the crackle of radio communications. Through the trees, he could see flashlight beams sweeping systematically through the forest. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Reeves, we should talk. You have something that belongs to me, and I have something you want, your freedom. Sunrise at the bunker. Come alone, bring the location. No police, no friends. Vincent." Jake stared at the message, knowing he was out of options. The hunt was over. The warehouse district felt like a graveyard at 3 in the morning. Jake crouched behind a rusted shipping container, watching the building where Marcus had arranged the meet. His Harley sat hidden 2 blocks away, engine still warm for a quick escape if things went sideways. Every instinct screamed this was a trap, but Elena's life hung in the balance. The building looked abandoned. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, weeds growing through cracked pavement. But Jake noticed the subtle signs: fresh tire tracks in the dust, the faint glow of light bleeding through blackened windows, and the way shadows moved with too much purpose inside. He'd called Detective Morrison an hour ago, leaving a cryptic message about the location. Whether the cop would show up was anyone's guess, but Jake couldn't walk into this alone, not when Marcus had proven how far he'd go to reclaim what he considered his. A black sedan pulled up to the warehouse entrance. Marcus stepped out, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place in the industrial wasteland. 2 men flanked him, the same crew from the motel, their bulky frames suggesting they came prepared for violence. Jake checked his phone. 3:15. Time to move. He approached from the south side, using the maze of abandoned machinery and storage containers as cover. The warehouse had multiple entrances, most boarded up, but he'd spotted a loading dock with a partially open bay door during his earlier reconnaissance. The smell hit him first: motor oil, rust, and something else he couldn't identify. Cigarette smoke drifted from somewhere deeper in the building. Jake slipped through the gap in the bay door, his boots silent on the concrete floor. The interior stretched into darkness, filled with the skeletal remains of manufacturing equipment. Conveyor belts snaked between massive machines, their purpose lost to time. Overhead, broken skylights let in scattered moonlight, creating a patchwork of shadows and pale illumination. Voices echoed from the far end of the building. Jake moved carefully, staying low behind the machinery, working his way toward the sound. His hand instinctively checked for the gun tucked in his jacket, Elena's service weapon, taken from her apartment before Marcus's men had arrived. "You're late," Marcus's voice carried clearly in the empty space. "I'm here," Jake called out, stepping into the open area where light fixtures still functioned. "Where's Elena?" Marcus stood beside a card table that looked ridiculous in the cavernous space. His two men positioned themselves at angles that covered the exits Jake could see. Elena sat in a metal chair 15 feet away, her hands zip-tied behind her back, a strip of duct tape over her mouth. Her eyes met his, wide with warning. "The woman is unharmed," Marcus said, straightening his tie. "She'll remain that way if you're reasonable. Let her go. I'll tell you what you want to know." Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off the warehouse walls. "After the trouble you've caused? After you killed 2 of my men? I don't think simple information is enough anymore." Jake's blood chilled. "I haven't killed anyone." "The motel room, very messy." Marcus shook his head with mock disappointment. "My associates went to collect you for this conversation. They never came back. The police found them this morning." The setup was more complete than Jake had imagined. Marcus wasn't just after the stolen motorcycles. He was eliminating loose ends and making Jake the fall guy for murders he didn't commit. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued. "You're going to take me to those motorcycles, all of them. Then you're going to disappear permanently, and Detective Walsh will suffer an unfortunate accident related to her investigation into your killing spree." Elena struggled against her restraints, muffled protests coming from behind the tape. One of Marcus's men moved closer to her, his hand resting on the grip of a pistol. Jake calculated distances, angles, odds. Even with Elena's gun, he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The warehouse offered cover, but also countless places for additional gunmen to hide. He needed a different approach. "The motorcycles aren't where you think they are," he said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "I moved them. After your boys trashed my place, I figured you'd eventually track down the location. So I relocated the bikes. The lie came easily, buying time to think. To where? Somewhere safe. Somewhere you'll never find them without my help." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded to one of his men. The gunman drew his weapon and pressed it against Elena's temple. She closed her eyes, her body rigid with fear. "You have 10 seconds to reconsider your negotiating position," Marcus said calmly. In the distance, Jake heard the faint sound of car engines approaching. Morrison, if luck held. But even if the detective came in force, the situation remained volatile. Elena was too exposed, too vulnerable. "Wait," Jake said, raising his hands. "I'll take you to them." Marcus smiled coldly. "I thought you might see reason." The engines grew louder, closer. Jake caught Elena's eye and saw understanding pass between them. Everything was about to explode. The warehouse felt like a tomb when Jake pushed through the rusted door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Dust motes danced in the pale morning light filtering through broken windows, and the air tasted of motor oil and decades of abandonment. Behind him, Sarah's footsteps echoed softly on the concrete floor. "Are you sure this is where Castellanos wanted to meet?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cavernous space. Jake nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at his gut. The phone call had been brief, Castellanos claiming he had new information about Vincent Torino's plans, insisting they meet alone at this forgotten industrial site on the outskirts of town. Something about the urgency in the detective's voice had felt wrong, but with Torino's men closing in and nowhere else to turn, Jake had agreed. "Stay close," he murmured, scanning the shadows between towering shelves lined with automotive parts. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet something felt deliberately arranged about their surroundings. Too clean, too convenient. A metallic clang echoed from the far end of the warehouse, and Jake's hand instinctively moved to the pistol tucked into his waistband. He'd taken it from one of Torino's thugs during their escape from the motel, though he prayed he wouldn't need to use it. "Castellanos?" Jake called out, his voice carrying across the empty space. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. Then, From behind a stack of oil drums, Detective Castellanos emerged with his hands raised. But something was wrong. His usually crisp shirt was wrinkled, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his eyes darted nervously toward the shadows behind him. "Jake, thank God you're here," Castellanos said, but his voice carried a tremor that set Jake's nerves on edge. "We need to talk about those motorcycles, about the real reason Torino wants them so badly." "What aren't you telling us?" Sarah stepped forward, and Jake noticed she'd positioned herself where she could see both Castellanos and the warehouse entrance. Castellanos opened his mouth to respond, but the words died as three men stepped out from behind the industrial equipment, their weapons drawn. Jake recognized one of them immediately, Franco, Torino's lieutenant, his scarred face twisted into a predatory grin. "Detective Castellanos has been very helpful," Franco said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, "though I suspect his cooperation wasn't entirely voluntary." Jake's mind raced as the trap became clear. They'd used Castellanos to lure him here, probably threatened the man's family to ensure compliance. The detective's guilty expression confirmed Jake's suspicions. "I'm sorry," Castellanos whispered. "They have my daughter." "How touching," Franco sneered, taking a step closer. "Now, Mr. Sullivan, you're going to tell us exactly where those vintage bikes are hidden, and then you're going to hand over whatever evidence you think you have against Mr. Torino." Jake's eyes scanned the warehouse, calculating distances and cover points. 3 armed men, 1 hostage detective, and Sarah to protect. The odds were impossibly bad, but surrender meant death anyway. "The thing is, Franco," Jake said, stalling for time while he spotted a fire axe mounted on the wall about 10 feet to his left, "I don't think Torino told you the whole truth about those motorcycles." Franco's grip tightened on his weapon. "What are you talking about?" "Ask yourself why bikes from a 1987 heist are worth killing for in 2024. It's not about the machines themselves." Jake took a subtle half-step toward the axe. "It's about what's hidden inside them, what your boss has been searching for all these years." The confusion that flickered across Franco's face told Jake he'd guessed correctly. Torino hadn't shared the full truth with his underlings. They thought this was about valuable motorcycles, not the small fortune in uncut diamonds that Jake had discovered welded into the modified fuel tanks. "You're bluffing," Franco said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Jake caught Sarah's eye and gave the slightest nod toward a gap between 2 shelving units. She understood immediately, her muscles tensing for movement. "The diamonds are worth more than the bikes ever were," Jake continued, edging closer to the axe. "But here's what Torino doesn't know. I already moved them." It was a lie, but it had the desired effect. Franco's attention wavered for just a moment as he processed this information. In that instant, Jake lunged for the axe while shouting, "Run!" Sarah bolted toward the shelves as Jake's fingers closed around the wooden handle. Franco's gun barked twice, bullets sparking off concrete where Jake had been standing. Glass exploded from a window above as Jake rolled behind a support beam, the fire axe clutched in his hands. "You just made this harder on yourself," Franco bellowed, gesturing for his men to spread out and flank Jake's position. But Jake was already moving, using his knowledge of motorcycles and machinery to navigate the warehouse's maze of equipment. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The abandoned warehouse loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a concrete monument to decay. Jake killed the Harley's engine 50 yards out, the sudden silence making his ears ring. Rain hammered the corrugated roof in steady percussion, masking any sounds from within. He'd chosen this place carefully, isolated, with multiple exit routes and far enough from civilization that gunshots wouldn't draw unwanted attention. Marcus Chen emerged from the shadows first, his expensive suit incongruous against the industrial wasteland. Behind him came 3 men Jake didn't recognize, their movements professional and predatory. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the pistol tucked beneath his jacket, then forced himself to remain still. This dance required patience. "You came alone," Chen observed, his voice carrying despite the rain. "Smart man." "Let's see the money first," Jake called back, staying near his bike. The engine was still warm. He could restart it and be gone in seconds if this went sideways. Chen nodded to one of his men, who opened a metallic briefcase. Even from this distance, Jake could see the neat stacks of bills. $2 million, enough to disappear forever, to buy a new identity and a life free from the ghosts that had been chasing him since he'd first stumbled into that underground bunker. "Now the location," Chen said, stepping closer. "The exact coordinates." Jake reached into his jacket slowly, producing a folded paper. "Everything you need is written down. GPS coordinates, the access route through the mine shaft, even a rough map of the bunker layout." He held it up, letting the wind catch it slightly. "But first, I want to know why these bikes are worth killing for, what made them so special that people died over them 40 years ago." Chen's expression didn't change, but Jake caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "You've done your homework. Enough to know this isn't just about vintage motorcycles. The heist in 1983, the 3 dead bikers found in the desert, the missing shipment that was never recovered. It all connects back to what's in that bunker." "The bikes were carrying something," Chen admitted, "hidden in modified fuel tanks and chassis. Something my associates had paid a considerable sum to acquire. Drugs? Documents. Prototype designs. Technology that was worth more than gold at the time." Chen stepped closer, his men fanning out slightly. "During the Cold War, certain innovations had strategic value. Industrial espionage was as important as military intelligence." Jake felt the pieces clicking together. Someone was selling American motorcycle technology to foreign buyers. The bikers were the couriers, and when they went missing, the entire operation collapsed. Millions in investment gone. Careers ruined. People died because of that failure. Chen's voice carried an edge of old anger. Now, 40 years later, that technology might still have value. At minimum, it proves certain relationships that some people would prefer remain buried. Thunder rolled overhead, and Jake used the sound to mask his movement as he shifted position. Something was wrong. Chen was talking too freely, revealing too much. In Jake's experience, that meant the man had no intention of letting him walk away from this exchange. "The coordinates," Chen repeated, extending his hand. "Give them to me, take your money, and disappear. Everyone wins." Jake glanced at the briefcase, then at the 3 men spreading wider around him. Professional killers, definitely. The kind of people who cleaned up loose ends permanently. "What guarantee do I have that this ends here? That you won't come looking for me later? You have my word. Your word doesn't mean much when 3 of your friends there look ready to put bullets in me the moment I hand over that paper." Chen sighed theatrically. "You're too paranoid, Jake. This is a business transaction, nothing more." But Jake was already moving. He'd spotted the muzzle flash from the warehouse roof a split second before Chen finished speaking. A sniper, positioned to take him out the moment the exchange was complete. Jake dove behind a concrete barrier as the first shot sparked off the asphalt where he'd been standing. The paper scattered from his hand, caught by the wind and rain. Chen's men drew weapons with practiced efficiency, but Jake was already rolling, coming up with his pistol drawn. 2 shots. The nearest gunman dropped, clutching his shoulder. Jake sprinted toward a stack of rusted shipping containers, bullets whining past his head. His mind raced through options. The Harley was exposed, sitting in the open where the sniper could pick him off before he reached it. The warehouse offered cover, but was probably full of Chen's backup team. The storm drains running beneath the industrial complex might provide escape, but he'd be abandoning the coordinates and any chance of controlling how this ended. Chen's voice boomed across the warehouse yard. "You're only making this harder on yourself. We'll find the bunker eventually. Give us the location and I promise you a clean death." Jake checked his ammunition. 11 rounds left, against at least 4 men, possibly more. The coordinates were scattered in the mud, but Chen would recover enough to narrow his search considerably. The game had changed completely. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, carved from raw stone and barely wide enough for two people. Jake's flashlight beam danced across the rough walls as footsteps echoed behind them. Kozlov's men had found the entrance. Sarah gripped his hand tightly, her breathing ragged from their desperate flight through the bunker's hidden passages. "How much farther?" she whispered, glancing back at the growing sound of pursuit. "I don't know." Jake's voice was strained. The old map Tommy had sketched from memory showed this tunnel leading to the abandoned mine shaft, half a mile north, but distances underground were deceptive. "Just keep moving." The beam of his flashlight caught something metallic ahead. As they approached, Jake realized it was an old mining cart, rusted and tilted on broken rails. Beyond it, the tunnel split into 3 passages. "Which way?" Sarah's voice carried a note of panic. Jake closed his eyes, trying to remember Tommy's directions. The old biker had been delirious when he'd drawn the escape route, muttering about following the water and where the air moves. Jake listened carefully. From the leftmost tunnel came a faint sound of dripping. "This way." He pulled Sarah toward the sound. The tunnel sloped downward, and soon they were splashing through ankle-deep water. The cold seeped through their boots, but the water meant they were heading toward the surface drainage system. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers grew closer, along with the harsh beams of industrial flashlights cutting through the darkness. "There," one of Kozlov's men shouted in accented English. "Water tracks!" Jake cursed under his breath. Their wet footprints were leaving a trail any amateur could follow. He pulled out his phone. No signal this deep underground, but the compass app still worked. They were heading northeast, which should take them toward the old mine entrance. The tunnel began to rise again, and Jake felt a whisper of fresh air against his face. Real air, not the stale atmosphere of the bunker. They were close. "Jake," Sarah tugged at his sleeve. "Listen." He stopped, straining to hear over their own breathing and the distant shouts. There, a rhythmic rumbling from somewhere above. Traffic. They were near a road. The tunnel curved sharply to the right, and suddenly Jake's flashlight illuminated a rusted iron ladder bolted to the stone wall. Above, maybe 20 feet up, was a circular opening barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "That's it," Jake said. "The mine shaft. What if it's blocked? Then we find another way." But even as he said it, Jake could see pale moonlight filtering down from above. The exit was clear. Sarah went first, her movements quick and sure despite her exhaustion. Jake followed, pausing at the bottom to listen. The footsteps of their pursuers were getting closer, but the sound was confused now. They must have reached the 3-way split and weren't sure which tunnel to follow. The ladder rungs were slick with moisture, and rust flaked off under their hands, but the metal held. Jake hauled himself up through the narrow opening and found himself in a depression surrounded by scrub brush and abandoned mining equipment. The highway was visible 50 yards away, separated from them by a chain-link fence topped with old barbed wire. Sarah was already moving toward the fence. "There," she pointed. "Someone cut a hole." The gap in the fence was old, probably made by kids or homeless people seeking shelter in the mine buildings. They squeezed through, just as voices echoed from the shaft behind them. "The road," Jake said, but Sarah was already ahead of him, running toward the distant glow of headlights. A semi-truck was approaching, its engine downshifting as it climbed the grade. Sarah stepped into the road, waving her arms. For a terrifying moment, Jake thought the driver wouldn't see her in time, but then air brakes hissed and the massive vehicle shuddered to a stop. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a weathered face under a John Deere cap. "You folks okay? Truck trouble?" "Please," Sarah gasped. "We need a ride. There are people." "Get in." The driver must have heard something in her voice that convinced him. "Hop in the sleeper cab." They climbed up into the truck, just as figures emerged from the mine shaft. Jake caught a glimpse of Kozlov himself, his pale hair unmistakable even in the darkness. The Russian was shouting orders, directing his men toward vehicles parked somewhere out of sight. "Where you headed?" the trucker asked as he put the rig in gear. "Anywhere but here," Jake replied. Through the rear window, he watched the mine entrance disappear into the night. They were alive, they were free, but Kozlov was still out there. And somewhere in that bunker lay $40 million worth of vintage motorcycles that would remain forever beyond reach. The truck gained speed, carrying them away from the nightmare they'd stumbled into. But Jake knew their ordeal wasn't over. Men like Kozlov didn't give up easily, and now they had witnesses to eliminate. The desert sun climbed higher as Jake positioned the last of the vintage motorcycles at the bunker's entrance. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. The Vincent Black Shadow gleamed in the morning light, its chrome reflecting the endless blue sky above. Beside it sat the Brough Superior, the Norton Commando, and 8 other pristine machines that represented millions of dollars and decades of secrets. Marcus Volkov's convoy would arrive within the hour. Jake had chosen this spot carefully, a narrow canyon approach that would funnel the cars into a single-file line, limiting their maneuverability. The remote detonator felt cold in his palm as he made his final preparations. The sound of engines echoed off the canyon walls long before the vehicles came into view. Jake crouched behind a boulder 30 yards from the bunker entrance, watching as 3 black SUVs navigated the rocky terrain. They moved cautiously, professionally. Volkov wasn't taking any chances. The lead vehicle stopped 50 feet from the motorcycles. Car doors slammed in sequence and 8 men emerged, their weapons visible but not raised. Marcus Volkov stepped out of the middle SUV, his silver hair catching the sunlight. Even at this distance, Jake could see the predatory smile on the man's face. "Mr. Reynolds," Volkov called out, his accented voice carrying easily across the desert air. "I must admit, you've exceeded my expectations. The collection is even more beautiful than I remembered." Jake stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible. "The deal was simple, Volkov. The bikes for my freedom. No games, no tricks." "Of course." Volkov gestured to his men, who began advancing toward the motorcycles. "Though I am curious, how did you find them after all these years?" "My father searched for decades." "Lucky break," Jake replied, watching the men examine the bikes. Wrong turn led to the right place. 2 of Volkov's men had reached the Vincent Black Shadow. One ran his hand along the fuel tank, while the other checked the engine. Their body language suggested satisfaction. These were the genuine articles, not replicas. "Extraordinary condition," Volkov murmured, walking closer. "My grandfather would have been pleased to see his collection again. He stole these beauties from a British collector in 1962. The man never stopped looking for them, you know. Died of a heart attack in 1984, still obsessing over his lost machines." Jake's jaw tightened. More victims of the Volkov family's greed. Ancient history. "Are we done here?" "Almost." Volkov's smile widened. "But there's one small problem. You see, you've caused me considerable trouble these past few days. Damaged property, injured personnel, disrupted my business operations. I'm afraid the motorcycles alone don't quite balance the scales." The trap was springing, just as Jake had anticipated. Volkov's men were spreading out, creating a semicircle that would cut off any escape route. Their weapons were now openly displayed. "Let me guess," Jake said, his hand drifting toward his jacket pocket. "You want the bikes and my life. Nothing personal, you understand. Simply good business practice." Jake's thumb found the detonator switch. "Funny thing about good business, Marcus. Sometimes you have to know when to cut your losses." The explosion ripped through the desert morning like thunder. The charges Jake had placed throughout the bunker detonated in sequence, sending a pillar of fire and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The vintage motorcycles vanished in the inferno, along with the bunker's entrance and everything inside. Volkov's men dove for cover as burning metal rained down around them. The shockwave knocked several off their feet and cracked the windshields of all 3 vehicles. When the smoke began to clear, nothing remained where the motorcycles had stood but a smoking crater and twisted fragments of what had once been priceless machines. "You maniac!" Volkov screamed, his composed facade shattered. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Those bikes were irreplaceable. Exactly, Jake called back, already moving toward his own motorcycle hidden behind the rocks. They're worthless to you now. Game over, Marcus? Gunfire erupted as Jake reached his bike, bullets sparking off stone around him. He gunned the engine and shot forward, using the boulder field as cover. More shots followed, but the terrain worked in his favor. The heavy SUVs couldn't pursue him through the narrow gaps between rocks. He emerged from the canyon and hit the main road at full speed, the desert wind whipping his jacket. In his mirrors, he could see smoke still rising from the bunker site. Somewhere behind him, Marcus Volkov was probably screaming orders at his men, but the chase was over. Without the motorcycles, Jake was just another biker on an empty road. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Sarah Chen, warehouse raid successful. Volkov operation shut down, multiple arrests. You safe? Jake smiled as he typed back with one hand, free and clear. Heading home, the desert stretched endlessly ahead, but for the first time in days, Jake felt truly free.